How to build an 8 GPU mining rig with 8 RX580 8GB Red Devil golden samples on an Asus Z270-P motherboard. Here's everything I'm going to be using for the build. You can see there are 8 Red Devil RX580 8GB golden sample graphics cards. Here's a closer look at the Red Devil. This is the thickest 580 I have seen. I think the thickest 580 available. The Asus Prime Z270-P motherboard. I'm going to be using 2 of these M.2 PCIE extenders or converters. I chose the G3900 Celeron CPU. 128GB Sata 3 SSD. 4GB of micron DDR4 RAM. 1 Molex riser. 7 Sata risers. And I'll be powering the entire rig with 2 750 G2 power supplies that will be linked together with this dual PSU cable. I'll be using one of my mining rig frames to build this on. BlackOctane 8 GPU mining rig frame with 7 LED RGB fans. And one thing that I did was that I swapped out the VGA cables that came with my 750 G2 power supplies because they only have VGA cables with a single 6+2 pin connector on them, while the Red Devils have an 8 pin plus a 6 pin. So I swapped those out with other cables from the rest of my G2 power supplies because I have so many. I took their 6+2 pin plus 6 pin cables, and I'm going to be using those with the Red Devils just so that they have all of the power connected to them. You don't have to do this, it should work with just the 8 pins, but I decided since I had the cables, why not? And before I get started with the build itself, I just wanted to do a couple of shout outs. The first one's to Michael, who emailed me information about building an 8 GPU mining rig. That was probably the first I heard of it, and that was about a month ago. So Michael, you know who you are. Thank you very much. Another shout out goes to Goldman Investor, who recommended that I try the Z270 or H270 Plus motherboard. I ended up getting the Z270P because here it's the same price as the H270P. So I just went ahead and got the Z version. So you can check out his channel. He's got a channel on YouTube. It's not in English, but he's got great videos on there. You can check out his videos, watch his videos, subscribe to his channel. And the last shout out goes to NiceHash. They've been able to build an 8 GPU mining rig with Z270A, and it would also work with Z270P or Z270AR with NVIDIA cards. So if you want an NVIDIA mining rig with 8 GPUs, you can do that. It will work. So with all the shout outs out of the way, let's get started with the build. Most of this video is done at 2 times to 4 times fast forward. I didn't want you sitting through an 1.5 to 2 hour video. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to install the CPU in the motherboard. I'll release the latch for the CPU cover on the motherboard and open it up. Take my CPU and carefully place it inside. Close the cover and close the latch. I've got my heatsink here, my Intel heatsink. Stick that on the motherboard. Push the pins down. They're all locked in place, they're in the proper position. Plug in the fan. And actually I plugged it in here into the system fan header by mistake. So make sure you do plug it into the CPU fan header. I did correct this after, but you know, when you're assembling it for the first time, just put it in the CPU header. Next I'll plug the RAM in. Take my 4GB of DDR4 Mircon RAM. slide it into the slot, push it down, lock it into place. And then I'm going to go ahead and put in the M.2 PCIe extenders or converters. This motherboard comes with some pins here that you have to put into the screw holes for the M.2. So I'm going to screw those into position. Make sure you put these in so your M.2 extenders, converters fit in properly, that they're flat. I'll just set my screw into the PCIe extender, stick it in and screw it down. Again with the second one, stick it in and screw it down. And now I have 8 PCIe slots on the board. I'll plug in the power for these M.2 PCIe extender converters. Now I'll start setting up the rig frame. First thing I do is I put on the SSD. I'm going to flip the frame onto its back and then screw the SSD in from underneath. There are several spots that you can screw it in. You can screw it in here. You can screw it in on the center of the back of the frame. Then I'll take the motherboard and I'll mount the motherboard on the frame. Screw the motherboard into place. You can use a variety of different sized motherboards on this frame. There are holes ready to mount smaller motherboards, even larger motherboards, the wider extended ATX boards. This frame is set up to pretty much use any ATX size board. Now that's screwed into place, I'm going to put my 2 power supplies on the rig frame. I've got these little stands here with some tape on the back. I'm going to place them underneath where the power supplies would go. 4 for each power supply. Now I'll take my 750 G2s and slide them into position. I already have all of my cables attached to the power supplies. The first one has the motherboard and CPU cable, 4 VGA cables, the peripheral cable, and 3 SATA cables. And the second one has 4 VGA cables, peripheral cable, and 3 SATA cables. I'll screw those into place. Now I'll connect the 2 power supplies together using the dual link cable. I'll wrap the 2 motherboard cables up with a tie for some cable management. It's going to be a lot of cables, so I better keep them somewhat tidy. Here's my dual link PSU cable. The end with complete wiring goes in the primary power supply, and the end with 2 wires goes into the secondary power supply. So this is the first power supply here. I plug it in like that. Take the one with the 2 cables coming out and plug it into the secondary. That'll jump the secondary at the same time I start up the primary. Now I'll plug the end of this connector into the motherboard. This way when I hit the power button, both will start up at the same time. Now I'll go ahead and I'll plug in the CPU power. I've got 8 risers to mount on the rig frame. The rig frame is set up with motherboard screw stands for all of the risers. So I'll go ahead and screw them into place. It's really nice to be able to mount PCIe risers onto these motherboard screws here. It really secures the GPUs into place. Most rig frames will just rest the risers on a bar, which is good too. It works fine, but the GPUs can move around a little bit more. Here they're really secure. They stay straight. You don't have to worry about them moving at all or bumping them with your hand, moving them left and right. Those are all screwed into place. Go ahead and start to plug in the power for the risers. So I'll plug the Molex in first, and then I'll plug in the Satas one by one. The 4 risers on the left-hand side will get their power from the secondary power supply. They'll each have their own cable from the power supply. The 4 risers on the right will share one cable for 2 risers and get their power from the primary power supply. Now I'm going to go ahead and plug in the M.2 PCIE. I'll plug both of these into a single Molex cable. And then I'll plug in the SSD to the last SATA cable. Next, I'll take the SATA 3 cable and plug the SSD in the motherboard. Now I'm going to take my USB cables for the risers and plug them all in. These SATA risers are really nice. The USB cables are really fat, really good USB cables. I'm really impressed with these risers. Now I'll go ahead and I'll slot all 8 of the GPUs. You can see just how fat the heat sinks are on these GPUs. Really incredible. Really thick heat sinks. This rig is heavy, I'll tell you that much. And I'll plug in my VGA cables. Again, I'm using the cables that I swapped out from my other power supplies because I have so many of them. I figured why not. You shouldn't have to do this. It should work with a single 8-pin, 6+2 pin. But I decided since I have them, why not? If you don't have them and you do want to plug everything in, you should be able to buy a VGA extender to extend the 6+2 pin to an 8-pin plus 6 pin or a 6+2 pin. Alternatively, you could probably order extras of these cables straight from EVGA. Now I'll just kind of tidy it up and slip the USB cables towards the motherboard. And I'll just do a little bit of cable management here, use some zip ties to kind of tidy up these cables a little bit, just so it's not as wild with all the cabling. There's so much cabling. The more I can kind of bunch these up together, the better. I'll go ahead and plug the risers into the motherboard. Last thing to set up on the rig frame are the fans. I've already got them mounted together. So I'm just going to put the two RGB controllers inside the frame a little bit here. And then mount the fans. I'll plug the fan controllers into the end of the Molex connector that I've used for the M.2 PCIE extenders on the motherboard. So I've gone ahead, I installed Windows 10 64-bit Pro. And I followed my guide for installing the combined driver fix to get the 580s working. After you install the drivers, you have to go into the motherboard BIOS and enable 4G decoding, so the motherboard can use all of the GPUs. Once you got your drivers installed and 4G decoding enabled, all the GPUs should show up in Windows. Here you can see all 8 Red Devils running. And you can see all 8 Red Devils are showing up in Device Manager. Just as a quick test, I'll go ahead and run Claymore's Ethereum miner. These cards get about 24.5 megahashes as they are without any overclocking or modding. So that's how you build an 8 GPU rig. I hope you liked the video, I hope it helped, and thanks for watching.